Look into my eyes like a window. Wherever it takes me, I will know. In spite of all the days.
Much has been written of the relationship between Paul McCartney and John Lennon, the two dominant frontmen of the Beatles. Never media shy, always competitive, and undoubtedly the finest songwriting partnership the world will ever know. But little has ever been written about the comparison of the lives of John Lennon and George Harrison, two men united with their place in rock and pop history, two men who followed their individual political and spiritual paths, and two men whose lives were cut tragically short. John Lennon and George Harrison were two guitars gently weeping.
George realised what he was up against with both John and Paul, and also me to a certain extent, because I must confess that I would obviously concentrate on the guys who were giving me the hits.
John Lennon made a stand. He loved America. He believed in self-expression. And the greatest tragedy really was his death.
I think George Harrison kept them together. He was the quiet one, but the calm one.
There are various stories about how the Beatles first met. Probably the best known of these is that in 1957, Paul McCartney, wandering by a fair at St. Peter's Parish Church Hall in Woolton, Liverpool, stopped to listen to a skiffle band called the Quarrymen, fronted by a young John Lennon. Paul just happened to have his guitar with him, so he stepped right up on the stage and joined in. George was a friend of Paul's, who was introduced to the lineup in 1958. After a flurry of name changes and lineups, the group settled with the name The Beatles, and the definitive lineup of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, led by their manager, Brian Epstein. After spending a frantic residency in Hamburg, where they learnt their craft and perfected their image, the Beatles returned to their hometown of Liverpool to spearhead the newly developed beat group scene, which was spiralling forward from the lowly Cavern Club to conquer the world. The Beatles became a global phenomenon, becoming the first British band to successfully sell out a major tour across America.
John, so far, all British pop stars have not made a tremendous impact on the States. How do you think you're going to fare?
Well, I can't really say, can I? I mean, is it up to me? No. I mean, I just hope we go all right, you know.
Are you going to vary your act at all for the American audience?
No, I mean, we haven't really got an act, so we'll just do what we do, stand there, sing and twitch.
There have been a number of stories in the press recently about you being under some nervous strain. Is there any truth in this?
No. No truth whatsoever.
With their clean-cut, self-styled image, the Beatles were mobbed by teenage fans wherever they went, in both public and private. The phrase Beatlemania soon entered the dictionary. Little did they know that this adulation would so easily turn deadly and lead to the death of John and the near death of George. What can be definitively said is that George Harrison and John Lennon were both indispensable in the band's lineup. They were giants of the music world, destined to come together to create the Beatles, a band the likes of which will never be seen again.
The question of George's contribution to the Beatles and what would they have been with him or without him probably really is a two-part question. Initially, he was really the third member of the band. Once they hit that roller coaster ride of success and he started to play some of those great solos, he was then accepted, I think, musically by Paul and by John as being a very, very integral part of the group.
George Harrison is always fated as the quiet one. Certainly, in a band where you had to compete for attention with John Lennon and Paul McCartney, it was no easy task, and George, of all the band, would sit quietly and absorb what was going on.
My first impression of George was that he was very shy. But when I saw John's outbreak towards this journalist who told him that beat groups, guitar-led beat groups, British groups would never happen, I I realised that he may well have been intimidated by both Paul, who'd been Mr. Smooth with all the rap, all the repartee all day, and John, who, once he lost or appeared to lose his temper, was absolutely brilliant with his oratory.
But George was, of all four members, the one most opinionated and interested in the band's financial affairs and marketing.
What about all the other different materials and things that bear Beatle insignias and, you know, your heads and photographs and things?
Well, what about them?
Do you get a royalty on that?
Yeah, just because anything that use the name.
Yeah.
There is a Beatle factory, isn't it? Which belongs to you?
No, well, there might be a factory producing things that was doing it already, but we don't own it.
There's a lot of people who make sneaky things and try to cash in on it. And then
we always get them.
You've had a few court cases, haven't you? Or you've had
no idea, because, you know, people like you thought we had a factory, though people seem to think there were. We nip home and start rolling out thousands of things. But actually, it's sort of fellas trying to make a bit of quick money, and they roll out all these things and put Beatles on it and then sell them off, so we've got to try and catch them, you see.
Whilst George always appeared to have a passive demeanour, he was more than capable of holding his ground in disagreements with John and the other band members, as George's school friend Rod Othan recalls.
I went up to see George just to say, you know, great show. And he got up from me, came across and was having a natter. And then up comes John Lennon. I'd never met John Lennon in my life, and he comes across and sort of says, "Hey, how are you, man? You know, how are you doing? Great to see you again." And started to push George out the way. And he wasn't taking any of that. They always say he was subservient. Not at all. He sort of said, he just looked at him and he said, "Don't be so bloody stupid, John." He said, "You don't know him." He said, "Now piss off." And we can always rephrase that if you like, but he basically was not going to be put aside by him at all. But I found that he stood up to them very well. People get this idea that you know, he was in their shadow, but I don't think he was in the slightest. He just was a quiet guy, and when he had something to say, he said it very forcibly.
George Harrison was a virtuoso songwriter who would have stood out in any other band for this talent. But in the Beatles, he had to compete with the formidable partnership of Lennon and McCartney.
I guess that with talents like John and Paul, who are probably the greatest songwriters of the 20th century as far as we're concerned, it's tough opposition, and they collaborated and kind of also rivaled each other in their writing. George didn't have anybody. George had to do it by himself. And so he worked away at it, and he had tremendous determination and application. He would craft his music meticulously with every little stitch in the canvas, and gradually built up his songwriting technique to a point where he became a great writer. He wasn't to begin with, but then he started writing great songs, and I've said Something, I think, is one of the greatest love songs ever written. It's a wonderful song.
It really was John and Paul's band, and it was that magic chemistry. What George did after a couple of years of the roller coaster, he added something with his guitar solos that neither John or Paul could, well, they didn't think about them. He just added.
Well, I think George realised what he was up against with both John and Paul, and also me to a certain extent, because I must confess that I would obviously concentrate on the guys who were giving me the hits. And in the beginning, George's work was kind of tolerated. Oh yes, we must have a George song in this thing. It's kind of saying, well, it's not going to be as good as the others, but we'll let him have it on, which was terribly unfair, I know that, and I do regret that. But you can't blame me, because I had to deal with two marvellous people as well as him.
George Harrison's musical influence within the Beatles should not be underestimated. At a time when the hippie counterculture was introducing the band to experimenting with acid and other drugs, George's interest in Eastern musical traditions would introduce the band to the sitar and other foreign instruments. Ultimately, studying the sitar under the teachings of Ravi Shankar would lead George to explore the faiths of the East.
When George Harrison came to me, I didn't know what to think. But I found he really wanted to learn. I never thought our meeting would cause such an explosion. That Indian music could suddenly appear on the pop scene.
In Indian music,
music, it's tied into the spiritual life. And so there's no way you can seriously get involved with the classical ragas of India without finding out what's behind it and behind everything.
His interest in other cultural music, Indian in particular, gave the Beatles a good twist. I mean, we talk about Indian music, but in fact, the first time we used a sitar on a Beatle record was on a John Lennon song, which had nothing to do with Indians at all, and that was Norwegian Wood. And the use of a sitar on that song gave it a wonderful twist. It was a kind of a jokey thing, but a very, the song itself is a very wry song, and it lended tremendous atmosphere to that song. And all of George's influences on the Beatles were very benign and tremendous.
George would bring the Beatles, plus entourage, to India to study under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, very much under the public gaze. Ultimately, this would lead George to follow the teachings of Lord Krishna.
Far from the noise and pace of city life, in the cool, clear air of Rishikesh, North India, Pathé News reports from the meditation retreat of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the man who, through transcendental meditation, is currently bringing peace of mind to the Beatles. Flower-loving Yogi told reporters that his brand of peace of mind could only be truly appreciated by intelligent men of the world with rewarding activities and high incomes. Among his most valued disciples were the Beatles, top of the pop pupils. He did his best to keep them away from outsiders, but George had a way for us. Ringo enjoyed the peace of togetherness with Mrs. Ringo. It was a very peaceful scene. Close behind, George and John, complete with blanket for even more peace. That great screen star Greta Garbo used to crave solitude. In these days, it's even harder to come by. But the Beatles have found it.
Well, George was a very spiritual person, and I think he was brought up in the first instance as a Catholic. I'm not sure about that. I think he was. But certainly he took to Indian religion and assimilated it and became a great devotee and a great believer. He really firmly believed that the soul was the most important thing of all. And he often said, you know, what are we here for? We've got to find out. We've got to find ourselves. And he believed very firmly in goodness and love and tried always to give that to other people.
Whilst in India, the Beatles' manager Brian Epstein would be found dead from an overdose of painkillers. The effects of this on George and John were all too obvious.
Yes. I understand that Mr. Epstein was to be initiated here tomorrow.
Yes.
When was he coming up? Was he coming up in the afternoon?
Tomorrow, just Monday, that's all we knew. And he was equally as interested as we are. But he wanted to know about life as much as we do. I spoke to him Wednesday evening, the evening before we first saw Maharishi's lecture, and he was in great spirits.
I understand that this afternoon Maharishi conferred with you all. Could I ask you what advice he offered you?
He told us not to get overwhelmed by grief, and to whatever thoughts we have of Brian, to keep them happy, because any thoughts we have of him will travel to him wherever he is.
When the Maharishi was embroiled in a notorious sex scandal, John and George returned to England.
We made a mistake.
The other people are making a mistake and go see him now?
That's up to them.
And we thought...
What? We're human, you know.
What do you mean by a mistake?
That's all, you know.
We thought there was more to him than there was, you know. But he's human. And for a while we thought he wasn't, you know. Thought he was...
John and George, as ever looking over the band's finances, returned to England to open a new boutique financed by the four of them.
George and John's with it, Aladdin's Cave, only they call it Apple. It's a new kind of boutique in Baker Street, catering for specialized tastes. George and John describe their new venture as a kind of psychedelic Garden of Eden for lovers of hippie gear with all the trappings of beautiful living. After explaining that, George thought he'd take it easy. He was lucky he could find the chair. So he settled back to listen to the latest kind of shop-warming music as played by the group who designed the store. They call themselves The Fool.
Where George found solace in spiritualism, John found his vocation in non-violent revolution. The Beatles had received MBEs in 1965.
How do you feel, John, about having the MBE?
I feel great, you know, we're honoured. We are, though.
Were you terribly surprised?
Yeah, you know, I mean, everybody was, I think. Well, I think we were the most surprised. Us and Donald Zack.
George,
Yeah?
what was your first reaction when you heard you'd been awarded the MBE?
Well, I didn't believe it really at first, but then when they sent me all bits of paper saying that, and you wrote it in the papers, well, you have to believe it. It's great, you know. Didn't expect it at all, you know.
In 1973, in protest at the British government's support of America in the Vietnam War, John returned his. Then he seemed proud of his recognition. Now he spurned it.
As a protest against violence and war, especially Britain's involvement in Biafra, which most of the British public aren't aware of, because all the press, TV and radios slant all the news from Biafra. All the stuff I learnt on Biafra from journalists, off-the-cuff folks, is a different story, and I began to be ashamed of being British. And I'm a patriotic nationalist, if the truth were out, and Yoko can vouch for that. I'm always fighting about what Britain invented, radar, and what all the different things we've done. But every day I just began to worry a bit more about it, and I was going to send the MBE back anyway. I could have done it privately, but the press would have found out anyway. He would have been here a week later instead, less impact.
Yoko's influence on John was nothing short of phenomenal.
Yeah.
She gave him the ability and the courage, probably the courage more than anything else, to go out there and do exactly what you wanted to do. Express yourself. Doesn't matter whether you got criticised for it. Doesn't matter whether other people wanted to judge you for it, because they didn't have any right to judge you for it. But she was the one that said, this is the way I'm going to press your buttons, you've got it, go do it, and he did it.
Will you now stop speaking out against the war because of
No, nothing will stop me, and whether I'm here or wherever I may be.
The great thing that John Lennon had was his ability to speak exactly how he felt. He didn't pander to people. He wasn't a diplomat like Paul McCartney was.
Some acorns with us that we hope to give to all the heads of state we can get to see everywhere.
What do the acorns signify?
They're symbolic of seed, which is symbolic of life, you know, and we'd like the presidents of different places to plant the seeds as a positive move towards peace instead of just shaking hands on photographs and talking about talks they're going to have about peace. I think they might think I'm going to hot up the revolution, you know. I want to cool it down.
You're against revolutionary violence, too. I like your song.
I'm against violence, you know, period.
Whether it's...
violence begets violence, as far as I'm concerned. It's been proved by what's going on in the States and the protest marches in Grosvenor Square in London. The only result of that was a lot of smashed heads and front-page headlines about violence. And it wasn't the press's fault, nor the cops' fault, nor the minority left-wing students' fault, or whatever they're called, you know. It was just because the whole form they take doesn't work, you know. It doesn't work because that's what happens when you do that. And we're saying this is one other way of doing it. This money, I'm using my money and my time to promote peace. And when the money runs out and the time runs out, we should have peace by then.
Yeah, you know, I just say whatever, violence begets violence. And, you know, I don't believe in anything else. And I don't believe there's any park or anything worth getting shot for. And you can do better by moving on to another city or going to Canada or go anywhere. And then they've got nothing to attack and nobody to point a finger at. You don't need all that education. You don't need to get your whatever it is, exams that you're going to finish. What for? To turn into them? Just move off rather than get killed. Stay at home or stay in bed or make love, not war. That's all we're saying. Just remember that. You should keep up a constant day-to-day solid advertising campaign as they do to us. They're on all the time selling their war and selling their products. We must do the same. You're always saying entice them and con them. You know, you've got the brains and you can do it. What?
We can do it. We can make it.
You can make it, man. We can make it together. We can get it together. We can get it together. Now that's all.
John's problem was that he was a genius, and he knew it. Those around him could often be only viewed as fools.
I don't know what I actually do with the thoughts, but they come out either on film or on paper or on tape. I've just got lots of tape, which I suppose if I put onto paper, it'd be a book. But it's just a matter of, do I want to make those tapes into paper or make the tapes into records?
Does it feel the same to you when you're writing something on paper and when you're writing a song lyric?
It does now. In the old days, I used to think that songwriting was this, you know, and I love you and you love me, and my writing was something else, you know, even if I didn't think of it quite like that. But then I just realized through Dylan and other people, Bob Dylan, not Thomas, that it is the same thing, you know. That's what I didn't realize, being so naive, and that you know, you don't write pop songs and then you do that and then you do that. That everything you do is the same thing, so do it the same way.
John's humour would often be interpreted as arrogant. And in America, he caused the Beatles a major setback when he proclaimed them to be bigger than Jesus. Outraged American churchgoers protested and caused a significant amount of damage to the Beatles' marketing machine.
I pointed out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. You know, but I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
This is Doug Layton and Tommy Charles reminding you that our fantastic Beatle boycott is still in effect. Don't you forget what the Beatles have said.
And don't forget to take your Beatle records and your Beatle paraphernalia to any one of our 14 pickup points in Birmingham, Alabama, and turn them in this week if possible.
Recording sessions with John could often result in a fraught battle of egos. As his friend Dennis Ferranti recalls,
John wanted to jam. He just wanted to have a good time. You know, man's got the money to have a good time. So he went in, and it was, I think it was John, Harry. I don't know if it was Klaus Vorman on bass. I'm not sure who was playing bass. It's been a long time. And they just went in. They just got in. He said, I just want to play old rock and roll songs. So in the course of doing this, somewhere along the line, Paul Simon, he invited Paul Simon in. So Paul goes in, shakes hands, all the introductions, and he says, Paul brought his bass. Brought his acoustic. So he says, what are we doing? John says, well, we're just going to jam. He said, it's just a fun thing. He said, just get into the moment, but I'll tell you when to come in. Paul said, okay. So John started strumming, and he's playing. And after a few minutes, like everybody, you know, John starts singing. Paul's like this. So then Paul starts to play, thinking he should jump in. So he starts, and John says, no, wait. He stopped at me, stop. I'll let you know when to come in. So he starts up again. And he starts playing, and a few more minutes go by, and he's singing a verse, and Paul's like, all of a sudden Paul starts playing, and John says, no, I'll tell you when to play. So this goes on like 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 times. Finally, the 5th time this happens, Paul gets frustrated, puts his guitar down and walks outside, and now he's in the control room with me, while John and Harry are like working on something, and he's walking back and forth in the control room saying, who does he think he is? So he's John Lennon. He says, I'm Paul Simon, I'm as famous as him. And I'm saying, oh yeah? And that was it. So while this is going on, John sees Paul's agitated. So he comes down, he says, what's the matter? And he says, well, you invite me here to play. Every time I play, you stop me from playing. He says, why wouldn't I came in there? So John says, you little twit. And they went back, and Paul finally got his guitar. And John said, well, if you don't want to play the way, you know, I'll tell you what, if you don't want to play, then don't go home. You know, you might as well go. Paul got his guitar and left. And we just later on, I mean, I can't go into the expletives that John used, but John was like beside himself. He said, I invite the guy to play, and the guy's making a big deal. I said, John, you didn't let the guy play, though.
In 1969, John Lennon had married Yoko Ono. The couple moved to New York, where Lennon was to live the rest of his life. Full of contradictions, this undoubted anti-capitalist would set up camp in the very heart of capitalism itself. This would often mean that John and Yoko were monitored by the FBI, as their friend Kate Millett recalls.
They were invading his privacy, trying to follow him, tap his phone, all the, you know, against the Fourth Amendment stuff. And they just were using all of their force and authority and all kinds of personnel simply to entrap him illegally in anything that they could make cause for kicking him out of the country, deporting him.
John, why are you being deported?
Well, the sort of official reason is something about we overstayed, both of us, so that's reason enough to throw us out. The other official reason is that I was bussed in England for pot. And the real reason is because I'm a peacenik.
Like John, George had found love in the arms of his wife, Pattie Boyd. But as the years progressed, the couple drifted apart, and she was ultimately to settle with his friend, Eric Clapton, as Tony Calder explains.
I got involved with a dress designer called Ozzie Clark, who in the 60s we worked with and was our hero and what have you, and he went through the drug period like so many of the musicians. And I tried to help him get back on his feet. And one day in came Pattie Boyd, who was George's wife. I mean, we all fell in love with Pattie Boyd. She was just incredible. Ozzie fortunately was gay, and Pattie knew that. And Ozzie did this incredible routine. He just ran his hands right over her body, right the way down, said, "Do you like this fabric?" And he just sat down, cut the cloth, stitched it all up, put it back on, and made this absolutely perfect cut on the bias dress for her. It made her look even better, and I've got to tell you, she looked fantastic. We all love Pattie Boyd. She was in and out of our lives very early on. And when she married George, it was the quote, the fairy tale glamour wedding. It was a glam wedding compared with Paul, compared with John's weddings. It was the glam London wedding of that year.
Pattie, do you think you can ever live the life of a normal housewife now?
Yes, of course. But why not?
Are you going to stay out of the limelight?
Yes.
Out of your own choice?
Yes.
And what about the family? How many children do you want to have?
About 3.
39. Give or take. Can I have the story of your romance? Pattie, how did it all start?
Well, we met on the set of A Hard Day's Night when George and the others were filming it, and I was chosen to play a part of a schoolgirl by Dick Lester and Walter Shempson.
Good old Dick Lester and Walter Shempson. Yes. Well, I've not been for Ram. And take it up from there. What happened then?
Well, actually, I asked Pattie out when we were making the film, and she said no, which was very embarrassing at the time, but it all worked out right in the end. And, yeah, in fact, I asked Pattie to marry me while we were making Hard Day's Night. So, yeah, surprise.
Oh, I thought he was joking. I thought, oh, poor boy, he doesn't really mean it. I'll pretend he hasn't said it.
And it's taken you this long to convince her?
No, not really. I just sort of wanted to stake my claim on her.
Look into my eyes like a window. Wherever it takes me, I will know. In spite of all the days.
We all love Pattie Boyd. She was fantastic. It is no wonder that Eric Clapton wrote that incredible song for her. When Eric wrote that lovely song, Wonderful Tonight, dedicated to her, you just knew that there was going to be no animosity between George and Eric. And I think it was at a period when George and Pattie had drifted apart. So whilst everybody wants to make up stories about George was angry, he wasn't angry. He understood because he was already on the path. He knew that he'd moved on spiritually from that relationship.
John Lennon was murdered on the night of the 8th of December 1980. He died in the arms of Yoko Ono. His assassin was a single man, Mark David Chapman, an insane fan.
The murder of John Lennon in New York last night is full of ironies. He just started a successful musical comeback after years of withdrawal. In his last recorded interview, he said what he liked about New York was the security, even the autograph hunters who only wanted a signature and then left him alone. And the man charged with Lennon's murder was an autograph hunter, Mark David Chapman, who, it's alleged in court this afternoon, came from Hawaii specially to kill Lennon. Yet, according to Chapman's lawyer, he admired Lennon. He liked him very much. And why did he do it? Well, ironically again, when Chapman came face to face with a man he admired, a man known for his love of playing with words, there was no communication between them. I understood his words, said Chapman. I didn't understand his meaning. Well, no one can understand the meaning of Lennon's death, particularly the citizens of his adopted city, New York, from where Peter Hobday reports. He begins outside the luxurious Dakota apartment block where Lennon was shot.
It's now 14 hours since John Lennon was shot here at the entrance to the Dakota building on West 72nd Street in the center of New York. And in those 14 hours, there's been a crowd here standing in more or less silent vigil. And the flowers have been piling up at the gate.
He's not dead. They're just saying that.
You know, the doctor just announced it.
Yes, but I don't care. They're just saying that to get people to leave. He's not dead. John Lennon can't be dead.
Mr. Lennon was struck several times. We're not positive at this time as to how many times he was struck. He went up the stairs. There are 5 steps that lead up into the watchman's area of the Dakota. He went through that area into an office inside where he collapsed to the floor.
John Lennon was a New Yorker by adoption. And as soon as the word of the shooting was out, carried by radio stations across the city, his admirers started to gather. Their reaction was one of disbelief.
The body has been taken over town across to East 30th Street to the medical examiner's office. And the medical examiner's office told the BBC this morning that 4 bullets were in fact shot into John Lennon, one of which went through the body, one of which remained. It's thought that he died almost instantly. Ringo Starr arrived in the city this morning, went to the Dakota, and since then has refused to make any comment whatsoever. As for the suspect, who remained here after he had shot Mr. Lennon, he's now, at the present moment, awaiting arraignment and to be charged on first-degree murder. Nobody knows why he came to New York in the first place, or indeed what the motive was in what seems to be a totally senseless killing. Ringo Starr had chartered a private plane from Bermuda, and he got into the Dakota building through the back to avoid that large crowd out front, which had been filling up both sides of the street, growing steadily in numbers since first light. He stayed altogether about 2 hours. The shooting happened just before 11 o'clock on Monday night, as the Lennons came back from their recording studios.
I saw John and Yoko get out of the other limousine. They walked into the gate, and oh God, let me just. Sure, take your time. And then I heard 4 or 5 shots. They were ear shattering. I heard Yoko, and I heard a woman screaming. It was Yoko. She was screaming, "Help me!"
Later, the local police station, the 20th Precinct, released the official version.
Has been about the Dakota for the last several days. He was there on Saturday asking about Mr. Lennon. He was there on Sunday asking about Mr. Lennon. And he was there again this afternoon when Mr. Lennon and his wife left for a recording session. He was able to obtain an autograph on an album from Mr. Lennon as he left for the recording studio where he was going. He remained at that location all evening waiting for Mr. Lennon to come back. Sometime shortly before 11 o'clock, John Lennon and his wife arrived back at the Dakota in a limousine. They parked the limousine on the curb right outside the Dakota. There is a driveway into which they might have gone, but on this occasion did not. They got out of the car, out of the limousine, and walked into the archway area of the Dakota. To the right, as you walk in the archway area, is kind of a vestibule, which has a doorway, a glass doorway. This individual, Mr. Chapman, came up behind him and called to him, Mr. Lennon, as he arrived at that doorway. And then in a combat stance, He emptied the Charter Arms .38 caliber gun that he had with him and shot John Lennon.
The body was then taken to the Roosevelt Memorial Hospital a few blocks away from the Dakota. John Lennon was dead on arrival. This morning, the body was taken off to the city morgue, and Patrolman Tony Palmer was with the corpse.
Arrived at the hospital, I was informed that it was John Lennon inside, and I had Yoko Ono with me, and then I realized it was her. As a matter of fact, I had given her a dime to make a phone call. She wanted to call friends, you know, and at that time I just thought it was, you know, I was just trying to be...
What have you been feeling since then?
Well, you know, I feel bad about it. You know, I was a Beatle fan when I grew up in that age.
It froze me. I came last night for basically my own reasons to show support for whatever. It wasn't really morbid curiosity. And this morning, I think I was here curious to see how everyone else reacted.
Symbolized hope, a new life, a new beginning. He was a great man.
You look into my eyes like a window. Wherever it takes me, I will know. In spite of all the danger, I will go. Don't know just what I'll find, what I'll see there. As long as you're with me, I don't care. 'Cause in spite of all the danger, I'll be there. You're the only one that keeps me satisfied. Oh, oh, oh. You're the only love that makes the world seem right. The world seem right. Oh, yeah.
John Lennon's death has shocked people all over the world. Yugoslav radio played many of his records today. East German radio paid tribute to him for his anti-war work. His fellow Beatles were in a state of shock. Paul McCartney said today that he can't yet take in the news. He said, "John was a great guy who'll be missed by the whole world." George Harrison was tonight said to be stunned. He said that after all we went through together, I had and still have great respect for him.
In a frighteningly similar vein, George Harrison was also attacked by a crazed fan. This time, the attack took place in George's home, and he was forced to literally fight for his life. Despite being severely stabbed, George overpowered the assailant with the assistance of his wife, Olivia Arias.
Michael Abram believed he was on a mission from God to kill the former Beatle George Harrison, and he very nearly succeeded. A court has been hearing how Abram unleashed a frenzied attack on the musician and his wife at their luxury home. Abram, who comes from Merseyside, denies attempted murder on the grounds of insanity at the time of the attack. The courtroom in Oxford has been listening to graphic details of the attack from Harrison's wife this afternoon. Our social affairs correspondent Dave Guest was in court as the story unfolded. Dave, the events that night sounded like everyone's worst nightmare, an intruder believing he had a mission to kill.
That's right, Gordon. Can you imagine? You wake up in the middle of the night after hearing breaking glass. You go downstairs and there's a man there screaming, shouting, waving a knife at you. Well, that's just what happened to Olivia and George Harrison. Only it got worse because the man then attacked George Harrison, stabbing him several times, and attacked his wife too. That man was Michael Abram.
So, Michael Abram is that man, you say. I mean, what is his defence for this?
He is basically pleading insanity. He's pleaded not guilty to attempted murder on the grounds of insanity. Opening the prosecution today, Simon Mayo said that Michael Abraham had had a delusional illness which made him think that he was possessed by George Harrison and that he was on a mission from God to go and kill George Harrison, a mission which very nearly succeeded.
And was George Harrison in court today to give evidence himself?
He wasn't. His evidence was given in a written statement which was read to the court, but it lost nothing in that. In fact, the court was silent, apart from the sound of journalists scribbling to get everything down. George Harrison described how he tried to calm Abram down by shouting Hare Krishna at him. That didn't work. The men grappled. The man stabbed Harrison several times. Harrison said he remembered lying on the floor, feeling the knife going into his chest, feeling his mouth filling with blood, and he thought he was going to die.
Well, George Harrison, as you say, wasn't there today in person, but his wife was. What did she tell the court?
She was. She gave the account of how she had tried to defend her husband. She had attacked Abram with a poker and then with a table lamp, but that had simply provoked him into attacking her.
It's tragic anyone should suffer such a mental breakdown and commit such a brutal act. We can never forget that he was full of hatred and violence when he came into our home.
Abram's descent into madness was fueled by his drug habit. On the streets of Liverpool, he became a familiar sight, wandering aimlessly in a world of his own, listening to music. He was often to be found outside the HMV shop, singing at the top of his voice. Abram became obsessed with the Beatles, and George Harrison became the focus of Abram's deluded thoughts. He believed Harrison was a sorcerer taking possession of his soul. He thought he had a God-given mission to destroy the former Beatle.
I'll come back, he'll come back for the honey, and you.
Harrison's generosity in supporting spiritual and needy causes knew no bounds.
There were two sides to George in his path. One was, if it's spiritual, especially the Krishna movement and all the spin-offs, he was obviously very generous with them. On the other hand, if it was to do with music or even handmade films, he would scrutinize the budget. He would argue with Dennis over costs. Obviously, when you're making movies, they spiral, slightly different to the music business. However, he obviously had a different feeling for the money he gave. He gave the people, the Krishna people, that wonderful house out in Hertfordshire. And that was publicized, and he didn't like that. How much he gave thereafter, I don't know, but I do know he carried on giving, and not just to them, but to other little groups. And he was always giving to groups that didn't come from what we would probably call established religions. He gave it to people that believed in God, not necessarily believed in the people that were meant to carry the word of God.
Whilst following a spiritual path, George had always held a tight eye over the band's finances. He had given both his name and his time to promoting many worthy causes, most notably the concert for Bangladesh.
I do believe that his spiritual path took him into a whole new domain of songwriting. His commitment to do and organise in as much detail as he did with the Bangladesh concert wouldn't have come unless he discovered his own spiritual path or discovered the part of his path he should start on and move forward with it. And it obviously affected his songwriting greatly through the rest of his career.
He also always made sure that the legacy the Beatles left behind was held intact. This had resulted on more than one occasion in having to use the legal system to prevent unauthorized exploitation of the band's name.
Former Beatle George Harrison has been giving evidence to the High Court in an attempt to prevent the release of an album based on one of the group's early performances. The CD has been produced from a recording made in Hamburg in 1962. The three surviving Beatles and Yoko Ono, the widow of John Lennon, claim it breaches their copyrights.
Once a member of the most famous group in the world, George Harrison now leads a secluded life. And his irritation showed as he arrived to defend the Beatles' name and to try to prevent the sale of the bootleg CD. People had differing ideas of what had happened or what might have happened 30 years ago. The former Beatle gave a fascinating insight into life in Hamburg in those early days. He described it as a lot of teenagers getting drunk and playing rock and roll, and a lot of crazy Germans jumping around. It was a wild thing, he said. He went on, "One of the problems with the Beatles is the phrase well documented. Self-proclaimed experts," he said, tried to tell what they knew and ended up telling more than they knew. The case is expected to last until the end of the week. Chris West, BBC News, at the High Court.
Like the other Beatles, George was a heavy smoker in his youth. This was to come back to haunt him when in 1999 he was diagnosed with throat cancer. He died on the night of November the 29th, 2001, at his home in California, his wife and family by his side. Harrison, like Lennon, was a great man of peace. His passing was mourned around the world.
Well, I never had the privilege of meeting George Harrison, but for the generation of Bertie and myself, we grew up with the Beatles. You know, their music and the band, the personalities of the band were the background to our lives. And I think people will be very sad at his death. And I think it's worth pointing out that he wasn't just a great musician and artist, but he did an immense amount for charity as well. And so he will be very, very sadly missed by people right around the world.
I'm very sad, devastated. We've known he's been ill for a long time, and just very sad to hear that he's passed on. I've spoken to Olivia, and she's been very strong. And I'd like to ask people maybe to be very kind to her and Danny at this time, George's son. He's a lovely man. I love him dearly. I grew up with him, and I like to remember all the great times we had together in Liverpool and with the Beatles, and ever since, really. Say I'm very sad for him and his family and for all of us. He's a fantastic guy, lovely man, great sense of humor. I was lucky enough to see him a couple of weeks ago, and he was still laughing and joking. Very brave man, and I'm just privileged to have known him, and I love him like he's my brother. It was a very sad day for me and for a lot of other people, but I think he would have wanted us, you know, to get on and be loving and remember him as the great man he was.
So George, this must be a very sad day for you, but how would you like to pay tribute to George Harrison?
It's been an awful shock today, because, I mean, we've known it's been coming for a long while, but it still doesn't prepare you for the day when it actually happens. George is a wonderful man and a fine musician, but most importantly, I think he was a very loving person, full of humour, and I don't think he really wanted to be a famous person. I think he wanted to do his own stuff by himself. And fortunately, he had, in Olivia and Danny, he had a wonderful family, and my thoughts are with them right now, because they've looked after him. Olivia saved his life when he was attacked in Henley, there's no doubt about that. And since he contracted cancer, she's borne wonderfully and borne him up and given him courage through his time. And so has Danny. Danny's been a wonderful son. So they're great people, and my heart goes out to them.
We pray for his soul to Lord Krishna, that he should give all the blessings for departed soul, and also pray to give strength to his aggrieved family, his wife and his son and other family members and friends.
In his honor and for his spiritual upliftment, we are doing prayers to Lord Sri Krishna, so that Krishna can give him his transcendental, loving devotional service.
George Harrison leaving this planet is a great loss to the music world, but also for devotees, and especially for me, because I was very inspired by his music, and he was also responsible for me to come to spiritual life through his wonderful spiritual music, especially the album that he made, which is the Radha Krishna Temple, which has very beautiful compositions of devotional songs.
George, I think his music will live on forever, and his personality. He's a very strong, loving man, but he didn't suffer fools gladly, as anyone who knew him will know. And he's a great man. I think he'll be remembered as a great man in his own right.
If George was still alive today, he would probably want to have one more great peak musically. Either another band, or some record that he would make that would be different to everything else he's done before, or even making a movie that causes everybody to stand on and say, wow, George Harrison made that? Unfortunately for George, his path was not what everybody expected it to be. And this is to do with his spiritual path, where he was trying to learn what he was here to learn spiritually. So it showed that his spiritual being wasn't meant to be here for long, because no matter what he did to himself physically and what help he got, his spirit was ready to leave. But it left us with a great legacy.
Words of love you whisper soft and true. Darling, I love you.